I once believed that my family was a real-life fairy tale. A cozy little house, family dinners around the table, laughter echoing through the living room. My father was my hero, my mother was my rock. I grew up surrounded by love and peace, never imagining that happiness could shatter, until it broke in a way that could never be repaired. My name is Emily Carter, and this is the story of how I lost everything and found myself again. My father, David Carter, wasn't a wealthy man when I was little, but he was the hardest working person I had ever known. He started with 2 old trucks and a dream to build his own trucking company. I still remember those childhood days when he'd come home, his clothes stained with grease, his body exhausted, but his face lighting up the moment he saw me. He loved his job, but he loved his family more. My mother, Linda, used to be a manager at a local restaurant. She was always busy with work, often complaining about long shifts and difficult customers. But she had a dream too. To be a full-time wife, taking care of her family and living the elegant life of the housewives she admired in magazines. And my father, like a hero straight out of a romance novel, promised her that one day, she wouldn't have to work anymore. That promise became reality when I turned 8. My father's trucking company took off unexpectedly after he landed a big contract with a supermarket chain. We moved from our small suburban house to a bigger home in a nicer neighborhood. I had my own room with a large window overlooking the backyard, where my dad built me a swing. Life felt perfect. Or at least, I thought it was. When I realized I wasn't free to move about, I was pretty sure I wanted to leave. I realized my mother quit her job right after we moved, but instead of becoming the devoted mother she once said she wanted to be, she spent most of her time at spas, shopping centers, or socializing with her new wealthy friends. She no longer complained about work, but I also noticed she no longer spent much time with me. Still, that didn't bother me too much, because my dad was always there. Every Sunday evening, no matter how busy he was, my father would take me out for ice cream. We'd sit on a wooden bench outside the little shop, and he'd listen to my stories about school with an attentiveness that made me feel like no one in the world could ever care about me more than he did. But one Sunday, just as we finished our ice cream, my father answered a phone call. I don't remember exactly what he said, only that his voice was low, with a hint of concern. "Looks like one of my drivers is sick. I'll have to take the shipment myself tomorrow." "Can I come with you?" I asked eagerly. He chuckled and ruffled my hair. "No, sweetheart, it's just an overnight trip. I'll be back in the morning." I didn't know that would be the last time I ever saw my father. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the shrill ringing of the phone. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but I heard my mother's piercing scream. She wailed as if someone were choking the life out of her. My heart pounded as I rushed down the stairs. My mother stood in the middle of the living room, the phone slipping from her hands and shattering on the floor. A police officer was speaking to her, but I only caught fragments of his words. "Accident. Highway. Didn't make it." My world collapsed in that moment. They said my father died on the spot, that he felt no pain. But how could they know? How could they be so sure? I didn't need their comfort. I just needed my father to come home. The funeral was held a week later. I don't remember much. Just the dark wooden casket, the overwhelming scent of roses, and my mother's heart-wrenching sobs. But even then, it all felt unreal. After my father's death, my mother changed completely. Within weeks, she met with lawyers to take over his company, talking about restructuring and revamping, as if she actually understood what she was doing. But I noticed the people who had worked with my father for years slowly disappearing. Some resigned quietly, while others spoke out against my mother's leadership, only to be swiftly fired. A few months later, the company that had been my father's pride and legacy crumbled. But that was only the beginning of the real nightmare. The collapse of my father's company didn't just mark the end of an empire he had spent his life building. It was the start of a new chapter in my life, one filled with pain and loneliness. My mother never spoke about my father again. She didn't seem to feel any remorse for destroying his company either. Instead, she started spending money as if it would never run out. expensive dresses, designer handbags, lavish vacations with new friends I had never seen before. Every week, she threw extravagant parties at our house, where laughter and the clinking of glasses echoed through the living room. While I hid in my bedroom, clutching the teddy bear my father had given me, feeling like a stranger in my own home. At first I still tried to reach out to her. I asked if she wanted to have dinner together, if she wanted to hear about my schoolwork. But she always brushed me off with a half-hearted smile and the same familiar phrase, "I'm busy, Emily, take care of yourself." Over time, I learned to stop asking. Then one day, my mother told me something that changed everything. "I've met a wonderful man," she said, her voice filled with excitement as she sat across from me in the kitchen. "His name is Mark Reynolds. The two of us are going to have a new family, Emily. Isn't that what you want?" I didn't want a new family. I had a perfect one. Until she destroyed it. But I said nothing, just lowered my head, feeling a lump forming in my throat. A month later, my mother married Mark, a tall man with a polished appearance but cold, unreadable eyes. Right after the wedding, he and his daughter, Olivia, moved into our house. From the moment they stepped through that door, I officially became an outsider in my own home. Everything changed instantly. Olivia, who was my age, but spoiled endlessly by my mother and Mark, took over the attention that had once been mine. I was no longer my mother's only daughter, and it was as if she had completely forgotten I existed. "Emily, you need to learn to share," my mother said when I protested Olivia taking my room. "You can move into the smaller one, it's not that big of a deal, right?" But it wasn't just a room. It was the place where my father had built my bookshelf with his own hands, where I had taped my messy childhood drawings to the walls, where my happiest memories lived. And yet, in a single afternoon, Olivia stormed into my room, threw my clothes onto the floor, shoved my belongings into a corner, and redecorated everything as if it had always been hers. I objected, but Mark just looked at me with cold, unblinking eyes. "This is your mother's decision," he said. "If you don't like it, you're free to find somewhere else to stay." A few days later, my mother fired Mrs. Diane, the housekeeper who had cared for me since I was little. She was the only one who remembered my birthday, the one who had held me tightly on the day my father died, the one who silently wiped my tears when my mother was too busy with her parties. When she left, it felt like the last piece of stability in my life was gone. I was nothing to my mother anymore. Around that same time, I started noticing something strange about the late-night conversations between her and Mark. One night, while getting a glass of water in the kitchen, I accidentally overheard them talking. "She's getting more difficult to handle," Mark said in a lowered voice. "You should consider sending her somewhere else." "What do you mean?" My mother's voice held a hint of hesitation. "I mean, Olivia doesn't feel safe with Emily here. She doesn't fit into our family. It would be better for everyone if she were raised somewhere else, with another family." I stood frozen, the glass of water trembling in my hands. "Are you talking about an orphanage?" my mother asked. She didn't sound shocked. Just like she was considering it. "Not necessarily," Mark said lightly, as if it were no big deal. "We could find a family to adopt her. A family that would actually care about her, and we could move on with our lives without the burden." A long silence followed. I held my breath, waiting for my mother to protest, to defend me, to say that I was her daughter and that she could never abandon me. But all she said was, "Let me think about it." My grip on the glass tightened until my knuckles turned white. I was no longer my mother's daughter, I was just a burden she was considering getting rid of. I ran upstairs, locking myself in the darkness, forcing myself not to cry. I used to think losing my father was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. But now, I realized that being abandoned by my own mother was 100 times more painful. My 13th birthday should have been special. But in this house, nothing mattered anymore. No cake, no presents, not even a simple, "Happy birthday" from my mother. I had gotten used to it. That morning, I curled up on the small bed in the cramped room they had shoved me into, listening to Olivia's laughter echoing from her room. the room that used to be mine. Downstairs, I could hear Mark and my mother talking, their voices fading as the front door opened and then closed. Someone had arrived. Heart pounding, I crept down the stairs. In the living room, two guests sat across from my mother. One was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and deep-set blue eyes. Beside him sat a gentle-looking woman with soft brown hair cascading over her shoulders. Her eyes met mine with warmth and kindness. "Emily," my mother spoke, her voice unusually soft. It unsettled me. "This is Uncle Thomas and Aunt Margaret. They're your father's family." I stood frozen. My father's family? My mother had never mentioned them before. Uncle Thomas gave me a small smile, but there was sadness in his eyes. "Hello, Emily. I'm your father's younger brother." I didn't know what to say. For the first time in 2 years, someone spoke about my father with genuine respect. "They're going to adopt you," my mother continued, her tone as casual as if she were discussing grocery shopping. "We all know you're not happy here, Emily. You don't fit into my new life with Mark. Thomas and Margaret don't have children. They can take better care of you." I stood in stunned silence. She was giving me away. I had always thought that, no matter how cold or distant she was still my mother. But on the very day of my birthday, she declared that I was no longer part of this family. I swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "So you just want to get rid of me," I said. My voice dry and hollow. My mother didn't deny it, she simply shrugged. "I think it's what's best for all of us." I turned to Mark, he didn't bother hiding his satisfaction. Olivia sat on the couch, arms crossed, watching me with smug triumph. Uncle Thomas stood up and walked toward me. "I know this is sudden, Emily," he said gently. "But if you're willing, we'd love for you to come live with us. You're not being forced. This is your decision." My decision? I glanced around the house one last time. The home that had once held my father's memory was now nothing more than a cold, empty place, filled with strangers. Mark and Olivia had never seen me as family. My mother had never stood by my side. There was nothing left for me here. I lifted my head and looked into Uncle Thomas's eyes. "I'm going," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. My mother didn't protest. She didn't cry, didn't hug me, didn't show a hint of regret. "Good," she said. "Go pack your things." I ran upstairs, my throat tight with emotion. I threw a few sets of clothes into a small suitcase, stuffing the most important things into my backpack. A single photo of my father and me, the teddy bear he had given me, an old journal. Within minutes, I was ready to leave. As I walked down the stairs, Olivia couldn't hide her smug grin. "So you're finally leaving?" she muttered as I passed by. I didn't bother responding. Uncle Thomas held the car door open for me. As I slid into the back seat, my heart pounded so hard I could hear it. "Let's go," I whispered. The car pulled away. I didn't look back. Uncle Thomas and Aunt Margaret's new home was in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't big or grand like the house I had left behind, but it was infinitely warmer. As we stepped inside, Aunt Margaret gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "You can call me Aunt if you'd like," she said softly. I didn't answer. I didn't know how to feel. The first few days in my new home felt strange. I wasn't used to gentle kindness. To having someone ask what I wanted for dinner. To knowing someone would be there when I came home from school. Aunt Margaret baked cookies for me, and Uncle Thomas helped me with my math homework. They didn't force me to be close to them right away. They gave me space to adjust, but were always there if I needed someone to talk to. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. Slowly, I began to believe that this place could be home. I no longer had to fear being abandoned. I was no longer a burden to anyone. For the first time in years, I felt safe. The years after leaving my mother's house were a journey of learning how to rebuild my life. At first I was hesitant, afraid that if I let myself trust someone again, they would abandon me just like my mother had. But Aunt Margaret and Uncle Thomas were patient. They never forced me to open up. They simply stayed by my side whenever I needed them. Every morning, Aunt Margaret made breakfast for me before I left for school. Every evening, Uncle Thomas helped me with my homework, never scolding me when I got things wrong, but instead patiently explaining each step. They weren't my biological parents, but they became the family I had always wished for. Under their care, I slowly found myself again. I threw myself into my studies. Not just to prove something to myself, but because I wanted to repay their kindness. High school wasn't easy, but I no longer felt as lost as I once did. I joined the debate team, tried my hand at the science club, and even participated in a few volunteer projects. I began to believe in my own potential, that I was capable of more than just existing. Unbeknownst to me, Aunt Margaret and Uncle Thomas had been quietly saving money for me from the moment I moved in with them. By my senior year, they sat me down and told me they had saved enough to help me go to college. "We're not wealthy," Uncle Thomas said as I stared in shock at the bank statement he handed me. "But we know you have great potential. You can do amazing things, Emily." I cried that night. Not because I was sad, but because, for the first time in my life, I truly believed that someone had faith in me. I was determined not to let them down. I spent countless hours studying every night, aced my SATs, and finally received an acceptance letter from the University of California's Business School. When I held the admission letter in my hands, my fingers trembled with emotion. I had done it. I had really done it. College was an entirely new challenge. I no longer had Aunt Margaret and Uncle Thomas by my side every day, but they never failed to call, checking in on me and encouraging me whenever I felt overwhelmed by my demanding schedule. I majored in finance with a clear plan. I wanted a stable career, an independent life, and to never have to rely on anyone again. During my second year of college, I applied for an internship program at Goldman Sachs. The competition was intense, but I gave it my all, pushed through every round of interviews, and ultimately secured a spot. The first few days in the high-pressure world of finance were anything but easy, but I refused to let anyone underestimate me. I worked harder than everyone else, took on extra projects, and always prepared thoroughly before every meeting. I wanted to prove that I belonged there. By the end of my internship, I received a full-time job offer from Morgan Stanley. I couldn't believe it. The girl who had once been abandoned by her mother, who had once eavesdropped on a conversation about being given away, now had a position at one of the largest financial firms in the world. I had truly rewritten my fate. At 25, I bought my first apartment. A small but comfortable place in the heart of the city. When Aunt Margaret and Uncle Thomas came to visit, I could see the pride in their eyes. "You did this all on your own," Aunt Margaret said, holding my hand. "We always knew you would." I started to enjoy the life I had worked so hard to build. I no longer feared that one day, everything would be taken away from me. This was my life, and I was in control. Then one day, I met Michael. Michael Anderson was a financial consultant I met at an industry seminar. He wasn't like the arrogant or distant professionals I often encountered in my field. He was smart, funny, and most importantly, he actually listened to me. Having lived with my stepfather, I knew what it meant to have an adult. At first, I was terrified of letting someone into my life. I had spent my entire existence building walls, reminding myself that I didn't need anyone. But Michael slowly made me rethink that belief. He was patient, never pushing me, never forcing me to face things I wasn't ready for. He didn't just love the person I had become. He embraced my past, with all the scars I carried. We dated for a year before he proposed. As I looked down at the ring on my finger, I couldn't help but think of the girl I used to be. The little Emily who once curled up in an empty room, convinced she wasn't worthy of love. Now, I knew that wasn't true. I had found my true family. I had built a life I was proud of. And most importantly, I had found someone who loved me. Not out of obligation, but because he truly wanted to be with me. My life had once been a series of losses. But now, I knew I had won. 3 months before my wedding, the past I had tried so hard to bury came back in a way I never expected. I was sitting in my office at Morgan Stanley, reviewing a financial report for a major client, when my phone suddenly vibrated. A Facebook message from an unfamiliar account. When I opened it, my heart clenched. "Emmy, it's Mom. I heard you're getting married." "Congratulations, I'm so proud of you, my daughter. I've changed a lot and I regret everything that happened in the past. I miss you so much. Can you give me a chance to make things right? I really want to be there on your big day." I stared at the screen, my fingers frozen. Linda Carter. The woman who abandoned me on my 13th birthday. The woman who handed me off to strangers without a second glance. All these years, she had never looked for me. When I graduated high school, she wasn't there. When I earned a scholarship to college, she didn't care. But now that I had built a successful career and was getting married, she suddenly remembered she had a daughter? I closed my eyes, steadying my breath. I knew why she was reaching out. It wasn't because she missed me. It was because she needed something from me. I had once been a burden she wanted to get rid of. And now, I was an opportunity she could exploit. I opened Facebook and typed a short response. "You are not my mother. You lost that right a long time ago. Don't contact me again." Then, I blocked her account. My hands trembled slightly as I set my phone down, but, deep inside, I felt lighter. I was no longer the little girl crying in the corner of a dark room, desperate for love. I had a real family now. I didn't need her validation anymore. That morning the sky was clear, and the sunlight stretched softly across the estate where we were holding the wedding. Standing in front of the mirror in the bridal suite, I smoothed out the fabric of my pure white wedding dress, my heart overflowing with happiness. Aunt Margaret adjusted my veil with careful hands. "You look beautiful, Emily," she whispered, her eyes warm with love. Uncle Thomas stepped into the room, his smile filled with pride. "Ready, princess?" I smiled. "I've never been more ready." But just then, there was a hurried knock on the door. One of the security staff stepped inside, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Carter, I'm sorry, but there's a man and a woman at the gate. They're insisting they're your family and demanding to be let in." My hands clenched into fists. I knew exactly who it was. "What are their names?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Linda Carter and Mark Reynolds," he said. "They claim to be your parents." Aunt Margaret immediately turned to me, concern etched across her face. I took a deep breath. "They are not my parents." Uncle Thomas placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "We can have security remove them." I hesitated. A part of me wanted to ignore them, to leave them standing at the gate, and let them realize they no longer had a place in my life. But another part of me knew that if I didn't face them now, they would keep finding ways to intrude on my life. I needed to end this. "I'll handle it," I said, gently removing my veil and walking outside. When I reached the gate, Linda stood there, her face twisted in frustration. She was dressed elegantly, but her clothes were outdated, no longer fitting the wealthy image she once had. Mark stood beside her, looking more disheveled than before, his expression irritated. "Emily," Linda called out the moment she saw me. "I knew you would come." I crossed my arms over my chest, my voice cold. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, family," she cried, her eyes glinting with forced emotion. "I have the right to be at my daughter's wedding." I let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Family? You mean the people who abandoned me when I was 13, the ones who called me a burden and tried to get rid of me?" Her lips pressed together, but before she could respond, Mark cut in, his tone sharp. "Look at you, Emily, living in luxury while your mother and I struggle. If you had any decency, you'd help us." So that was it. They weren't here because they cared about me, they were here because they needed money. I stared at them, feeling an unexpected sense of calm. "You have no right to ask anything of me. I owe you nothing." Linda opened her mouth to argue, but I lifted a hand to stop her. "There is no place for you in my life anymore," I said firmly. "I have a real family now. People who love me not because they have to, but because they truly want to. And you are not part of that. I turned to the security staff. But please escort them out. Emily! Linda screamed as two security guards stepped forward. You can't do this to your mother. I looked at her one last time. I just did. Then I turned and walked away, leaving them to be escorted off the property. When I returned to the bridal suite, Uncle Thomas and Aunt Margaret were waiting, their faces filled with concern. Are you okay? Aunt Margaret asked gently. I took a deep breath, then smiled. I've never felt lighter. I stepped onto the aisle where Michael was waiting for me. The moment he saw me, he smiled, his eyes full of love. Today was not a day for the past to return. Today was the day I started a new life. The life I chose for myself. Emily Carter's story is a powerful testament that a painful past does not define who we are. It is how we overcome it that truly matters. Abandoned by her birth mother and losing the family she once believed was whole, Emily refused to let her pain consume her. Instead, she fought to rise above it, found a real family, built a successful career, and ultimately discovered true love. Her story is a reminder that sometimes, our greatest losses pave the way for a new life. One that is stronger, fuller, and happier than we ever imagined. Emily Carter's life is a journey from pain to happiness, from loss to freedom. What do you think about her story? If you were in Emily's shoes, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to follow the channel for more meaningful stories about life and family.